NärCon is the biggest gaming and anime convention in the Nordics. More than 13,000 people gather every year to share their love of geeky activities. Today I'm gonna have a look at cosplay and a lot of other cool stuff. And I'm also gonna ask myself how geek culture has evolved in Sweden over time. I have a long history as a geek, and I've been into just about every type of geekdom you could think of. But all of my experiences are, well, just my personal experiences. You might have different experiences, and things might have been different in different parts of the country. But I'm gonna offer my view on how pop culture and geeky activities have changed over time in Sweden. Let's start far back in the mists of time, in a decade called the 1980s. The 80s was a weird time. It was a time of Miami Vice and strange fashion. It was a time of yuppies getting rich off the stock market and of political unrest. But it was also a time when home computers started to become a thing, and when game consoles rose from the ashes of the 70s. The Commodore 64 and the VIC-20 were really popular in Sweden, and piracy was rampant. Every kid who had a computer copied games on tape from others. The ethics of it all wasn't even a consideration back then. Everyone pirated games. But there were other geeky activities as well. When I grew up, I knew a lot of kids from different cultures who had moved to Sweden, and they showed me some really exotic cartoons all the way from Japan. Giant robots were fighting other robots, and it looked absolutely awesome. And they called it something strange. Anime. Aside from that, anime was almost non-existent in Sweden back then, but there were some exceptions. Silver Fang, Star Blazers, and Star Zinger were available on home video, for example. Truth be told, I wasn't really exposed to all that many geeky things back in the 80s, because my family wasn't very wealthy. We couldn't afford a Commodore 64 or a game console, and I only watched a couple of episodes of Star Zinger again and again because we had copied it from a rental VHS tape. I could just stare longingly at ads for game consoles or imported Japanese anime, but all of that changed in the 90s. The 90s was a time of change. The Cold War was over and the world seemed hopeful. Still, there were conflicts. Yugoslavia erupted into a long and bloody war, and there were wars in Congo and Rwanda as well. But also, the Baltic states declared their independence from the Soviet Union, and Germany was reunited. And geek pop culture really started to thrive in Sweden. If you want to see more of NärCon, I also have a second channel called This Is Geeky, where I'm gonna put up a lot more content from this convention. Sweden got a rough start in the 90s with a financial crisis in the beginning of the decade, but things slowly got better. During the 90s, the price of home computers and game consoles dropped a lot. Suddenly, more and more people had a Commodore 64, and later an Amiga as well. And the NES was present in just about every household. Nintendo was completely dominating the Swedish game console market, and they continued to do so with the Super Nintendo. Something else that happened in the 90s was the rise of the internet. It's hard to imagine just how different the world was before the internet. All your geek news came from paper magazines, and it took months or even years for news to spread. But in the late 90s, you could go online and visit message boards or IRC chat rooms and talk to people from all over the world. And you could also get exposed to pop culture from different countries, such as Japan. People started ordering weird and wonderful movies and anime from abroad. It was difficult and expensive, but it was a lot easier now that the internet was in place. The 90s was when I saw the anime movie Akira for the first time, and that was mind-blowing. This was nothing like Disney, and it was nothing like the crappy anime I'd seen as a kid. This was something new. Pop culture in Sweden had been completely transformed by the year 2000. Anime and Japanese culture was commonly talked about, at least in some circles. I studied computer science in the town of Linköping back then, which incidentally is exactly where we are right now. And I spent a lot of time among other geeks. The university had a 10 megabit internet connection at every student room, so ideas as well as content was shared across all of campus. I was once contacted by the university administration who asked why I had so much outgoing internet traffic. I replied that, oh, that's just my FTP where I serve fan-subbed anime. And they shrugged and said, oh well, no one is gonna sue you over that, so it's okay. I basically devoured anime back then. Rurouni Kenshin, Irresponsible Captain Tyler, Slayers, Initial D, and of course Evangelion. And of course I watched a lot more than that. Hunter x Hunter, Magical Knights Ray Earth, the Miyazaki movies, Flame of Recca, the list just goes on. And J-pop was the back then. I know that K-pop is much more popular these days, but I still have a soft spot for J-pop. Something that wasn't happening yet back then was cosplay. You never saw anyone dress up in those days, it just wasn't a thing. Yet. Aside from anime, movies was also a big thing. Cult movies, that is. At university, there was a yearly cult movie night where people were exposed to such classics as Samurai Cop and Ringu. People loved importing and sharing strange movies from the US and Asia, and kung fu movies were also quite popular. Jet Li and Jackie Chan movies became all the rage in our geeky part of Sweden for a while, for example. And let's not forget about computers and games. By the 2000s, gaming wasn't just something that uber nerds did. PC gaming had taken over from home computers, and everyone had a game console. 3DFX had introduced the Voodoo graphics cards, which transformed the PC gaming market, introducing things like accelerated 3D graphics and colored lighting in Quake 2. That sounds pretty ridiculous these days, but it was really impressive back then. After that, Nvidia soon took over the graphics card market, and there were a lot of awesome games to play. GTA, Half-Life 2, Bioshock, and tons more. But the console market was also extremely big. The Final Fantasy games were immensely popular, as were Tony Hawk and Gears of War. And fighting games had a special time during the early 2000s as well. I still have fond memories of playing Tekken 3 as a drinking game. The winner had to take a shot every time. The idea was that after a few shots, the skilled players would become, well, less skilled, and the normally less skilled players would be able to win. Poor Jonas was unfortunately just too good at the game. He kept drinking shot after shot, but he never lost. Geek conventions and fairs are really common in Sweden these days, but it didn't always used to be that way. In the 90s, I used to go to gaming and computer fairs whenever I could, but those were few and far between. Those fairs were places where you could pick up cheap games and see new technology. I tried VR for the first time in the 90s at one of those fairs, and aside from added texture mapping, there really isn't all that much difference compared to today. There were also role-playing and board gaming conventions back then, such as GothCon, which is insanely old, and LinCon. But over time, more and more conventions and fairs started to emerge. NärCon, this convention, started in 2002, and GameX, which later became Comic-Con Stockholm, started in 2010. And these newer conventions and fairs had a greater focus on pop culture in general. I've already made a video about the history of cosplay in Sweden, but essentially it wasn't really a thing until 2010. Then it exploded in 2011 when the first Swedish cosplay championships were held, and it's just been growing and growing every year since then. I think it's safe to say that cosplay is one of the biggest activities at both NärCon and Comic-Con these days. But not at GothCon or LinCon. Those older conventions are still mostly focused on role-playing and board games. Those conventions attract a different type of geekdom, maybe more nerds rather than geeks, if those terms really have any meaning any longer. Come to think of it, is there really a point to calling anything geek these days? Isn't it all just pop culture? It's been a wild ride for geeks in Sweden, all the way from the 80s up until 2023. I've talked a bit about my experiences in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, but I haven't really talked about the 2010s. That's because the geek experience has been essentially the same in all Western countries since then. There are weebs and otakus everywhere, and people in all countries play the same games and watch the same movies. The world has been truly globalized, and Sweden isn't very different from, for example, the UK or Italy. These days, you can enjoy cosplay and anime, games and K-pop in every convention you attend, in every country. But I still hope that you enjoyed this look at NärCon in particular, and also my personal experiences about how pop culture in Sweden has changed through the decades. Well, that's about it. I have a lot more geeky stuff to do here at NärCon, but you should like and subscribe. But most importantly, have a great day. Oh, and check out this video up here as well. I'm gonna put a geeky link up here in the corner.